Hello, you're watching Breakfast with Nagwan Chatting and Charlie State.
Good morning to you. It's coming up to 6:30. Now, judges in England and Wales will soon be given new authority to force the most serious offenders to attend their sentencing hearings.
It follows several high-profile cases, including that of nurse Lucy Letby, in which killers have refused to be in the dock to hear their sentence handed down.
Now, we're joined now by Mark Fairhurst, who's the National Chair of the Prison Officers Association. Mark, morning to you. What do you think of this move?
Well, I commend the government for actually listening to the voice of the victims and their families, the voices that are so often ignored. The practicalities of enforcing this legislation will be difficult, but we can do it. We've done it in the past. And if they need to appear in a dock, that's what will happen.
What do you mean you've done it in the past?
So the judges always had it within their gift to order someone to appear in the dock in front of them. In that instance, we have the power to use force to enforce that order from the judge. And what this legislation does, it backs up the judge's decision, because in the past they didn't have the opportunity to extend the sentence if someone refused, whereas now they do. So that's welcome.
So when in the past, if a judge has given that order, they must attend, what's happened?
So we would explain to the prisoner that they were required in the dock, and if they refused, we would have a lawful order to restrain them, cuff them, take them to the dock where the judge would hand down sentence. But of course, in the dock, if they continue to be violent or abusive or disrupt proceedings, then the judge would simply say, take them back to the cells, and that's what would happen.
Have you had personal experience of where that scenario, and we know many families have said, this is what we want. We want the perpetrator in the dock so we can see them, so they hear, and it's all visible. Have you seen situations where that has not had the desired effect because something's happened in the courtroom because they've been forced to be there?
Yes, so when we ran the courts in the 90s, the public sector ran the courts, we quite often had to restrain people into the dock. 9 times out of 10, they'd just conform once they were in the dock and they were cuffed and in front of the judge. But there have been occasions where they've been violent, they've been abusive to the judge, they've been abusive to the families, and that's traumatic for everyone. In that scenario, the judge would just order us to take that person back to the cells, which we did. But there's a risk to staff, injuries to staff, there's a risk to prisoners, injuries to prisoners. And of course, it's traumatic for the victims and their families if they experience that.
That's what I was going to ask you, because clearly we're dealing here, and the cases we're talking about particularly are the worst of crimes. Yeah. And so the last thing you want to do is present a situation in the courtroom which could further make the situation even worse for the families watching.
Yeah, that's correct. And of course, if you're receiving an extremely lengthy sentence or a whole life tariff, is this legislation going to affect you? Because you're not really concerned about the consequences. So we have to work through the practicalities of this. And the only way I can see it working would be to have what we call control and restraint teams on standby in every court in full personal protective equipment, so the risk of injury is reduced. They would then be called to the prisoner if they refuse to go to the dock, restrain them, cuff them, take them into a dock. But we'd have to have a total refurbishment of the dock, because we'd have to have a secure seat where we could restrain them. And we'd have to have the dock soundproofed. So if they disrupted proceedings, nobody could hear them. That way, the victims would be able to look them in the eye and read out their impact statements.
So just in terms of having a separate team, can you just take me through this? So when they are collected from prison, that team is not the same team and puts them in a van to kind of take them to the court. That team's not the same team that takes them into the dock.
No, so what would happen, the prisoner would be in their cell in a prison. We would go to them, you're required in court. They would refuse. We would then restrain them, take them to reception, where we would put them on transport to the court. And of course, at the other end, if they're still violent, the court staff have to then restrain them off the transport into a court cell.
We're talking, obviously, we don't want the families of victims to have any more distress, any further distress. Would there be a choice available to them, for example? So if the judge knew, would it be able to be communicated to the judge that this is a disruptive prisoner, we know she is going to be disruptive and cause distress, and then a decision can be made? Yeah. And so he could inform the families and say, look, this is likely to happen. What do you want? Is that part of the process?
This is
just down to the judge?
This is one of the practicalities I think we have to work through. We all have to work through this. Do we pass that intelligence on to the judge? Does he relay that to the families? Do the families then have a choice?
Sure.
Well, if the families want that person to appear, we should respect the family's choice, the victim's choice. But there may be an opportunity to do that remotely. Is there an area in a court where we can put a video suite? We know we have video suites in prisons. Could we facilitate that remotely so at least the victims and their families get justice and get to read that impact statement out?
Can I just go back, Mark, to what you said a moment ago about the practicalities of that space where the prisoner will be? Did you say you'd have to have it's almost unpalatable talking about this, but I'm just trying to get it clear in my head. A seat with some kind of restraint attached to it within a soundproof box. Is that what you're talking about?
So the only way I can think of this working in practice, if we're really serious about enforcing this legislation, would be have a secure seat in a dock.
What does that mean? Sorry, what does that mean?
So you could cuff a person into a seat and strap them in a seat so they were forced to face the judge and their families.
And that seat itself is bolted to the ground.
Yeah, you would have to. It's the only way I can see of doing it, unless you're going to facilitate it remotely, where the victims don't have to listen to any abuse that is being thrown out by the perpetrator.
Can I ask you, I know that almost everyone is agreed that this, in principle, this is a good idea. Yeah. Do you worry that the government making this announcement, they have not thought it through properly in terms of, for example, your members, the people that are going to have to do it? Are you worried they haven't thought it through?
I worry that it's just a headline. I'm glad that they've listened to the voice of the victims, but in practice, sit down with us and let's work it through. Let's make sure that the risk to staff is reduced. Let's make sure that the families think they're getting justice and can read out those impact statements. Let's work this through practically and put alternatives in place if we're really serious about enforcing this legislation.
If you have not had a conversation yet with anyone from the government in connection with this latest announcement?
Not yet, but I'm willing to work through the practicalities with them and the families and the victims.
Very interesting talking to you this morning. Thank you very much. Mark Fairhurst is the National Chair of the Prison Officers Association.
Thank you.